pandemic, the African countries was taken by surprise by the Russian-Ukrainian war on its repercussions on the African countries. In this lecture, we'll be discussing these economic repercussions on our economies and the economies of the African countries, and also the diplomatic situation stands, the future relations with Russia, and the future of the international regional balances. And in the light of this crisis, we'd like to welcome Dr. Jihan Abdessalam, Professor of Economics at the Higher African College, Cairo University, Dr. Shireen Jaber, Senior Assistant Researcher at the Strategic Studies Center, Alexandria Library. I'm Dr. Iman Zahran. After that, we'll open the floor for questions and answers. We will start with Dr. Shireen Jaber, Senior Researcher at the Diplomatic and Political Studies at the Alex University, the Alexandria Library. The floor is yours. Good evening for you all. Thank you, Dr. Haifa, for this nice presentation. Thank you for your cooperation and for inviting us to be speaking here. It is my honor to be participating with you in this, with the center, King Faisal Center, and also to participate in this very important meeting to speak about this important event. And I hope that it will be very helpful and beneficial. As you mentioned, I will be speaking about the political repercussions of the Ukrainian-Russian war and the future of the and its impact on the world in general, impacting the whole world in general, and the political repercussions of the Russian-Ukrainian war on the African continent. And we have seen a lot of these repercussions, and it is expected that these repercussions will stay for a longer time, given that the African continent is one of the most prominent areas of prominent arenas of Russian Western competition at the present time. Hence, I can say that among of the most important points will be the next points. First, here I'm going to speak about a very important point. The first point is the exacerbation of the three security risks: terrorism, organized crime, and conflict. And we all know that in light of the high rate of food security in African countries and the low standard of living for the citizens, this pushes them to migrate and to leave their countries in search for suitable economic opportunities. This is a main driver for the occurrence of conflicts in countries, and this leads to political instability in the region. And in the light of this degrading or deteriorating humanitarian issues and political issues, citizens may tend to join these terrorist groups in order to find the money and to find job opportunities. And these terrorist groups take advantage of this in order to hire large numbers of people. And sometimes youth or young people try to find another way in order to participate, like Niger, for example, announced that a number of their young people would like to participate in the Russian-Ukrainian war in support for Ukraine as mercenaries. And also other countries announced that they have some young people who would like to fight for the side of the Ukraine. And here we find a very important program that the picture or the stereotype picture of the Arab country as will be changing, as it will be the mercenaries source for the world, and the security companies will have large numbers of mercenaries, and this puts us in a problem. How these countries will deal with these mercenaries when they come back to their own countries. The second point that I want to talk about, and we will touch upon this point in the next period, which is the decreased support in the fight against terrorism. We know that the Western countries are supporting African countries in terms of fighting terrorism, and there are budgets that are being provided for this kind of support. And each country had their own priorities, and the priority now is for the Russian-Ukrainian war, and this makes us expect that in the next period, uh, aid and military support provided by the Western European countries to the African countries will be decreased, and maybe Russia also will be reduce this kind of support as well, because the international economy is decreasing in a whole, and that's why these countries will start to direct these monies to support their own budgets and to weaponize their own militaries in order to deal and to handle the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And this will impact the whole African continent. And we noticed that the Danish Minister of Defense, before the Ukrainian-Russian war 2 years ago, he announced that they will withdraw a number of the Danish troops in Guinea Gulf. They were supposed to be there fighting pirates in the Guinea Gulf, but he said that we will withdraw our troops and the Danish troops will support the Ukrainian troops, and also Algeria itself will be also impacted and affected by that, because the south of Algeria, as we know, there are borders with the Mali, Niger, and Mauritania. They have common borders, and when Russia withdraws their own troops from there, this will lead to some kind of void in these countries, and this will lead to the activity, the reactivation of the groups like of terrorism. Signal groups, Russian groups, proved that they were very effective compared to the French troops in their fight against terrorism. It is also expected that this kind of support provided for the also these kinds of troops that are providing peacekeeping efforts, support of peacekeeping from will be affected on the continent, that is likely to suffer because the situation deteriorates as Russia participates in large numbers, and this will affect a lot because of the Russian-Ukrainian war. There is another point that is very important, which is the restructuring of the political alliances, and this is not only in the African continent, it's all over the world, but I will focus more on the African continent. So in light of the war that is happening now, every party of the conflict are trying to do these efforts for the reshaping. Russia has this increasing impact recently in Africa, the African continent, and each country or each party tried to make some pressures, and also maybe the Russian presence is more effective because recently they had there were some numbers of reports that the United States of America is on its way to reduce its presence in Africa by maybe 10%. And also other reports stated that and expected that the counterterrorism troops will be withdrawn from the African continent. And this impacted the idea of the conflicts. And we also witnessed that after the Russian-Ukrainian war, there was a visit that was done by the Vice President of the Sudanese Sovereign Council, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, to Moscow, and this reflected Sudanese tacit support for the Russian position, as well as we notice also the Eritrean vote and stand in the General Assembly against for the resolution voting for the condemning of the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, and it was the only African country that did not that refused this decision, and this was a very important stand by Eritrea in the current days. Maybe they have their own interests, national interests in the region, and I think that Eritrea is counting on Russia and that Russia will be an international polar of power in the near future, and this will put Eritrea in a difficult situation if the African continent is an arena for competition or confrontation between Russia and the West. Also, this geopolitical impact on Algeria is evident as well. We found that after the war began, there were some visits, whether by Russian leaders or by the U.S. Secretary of State and also his vice president. Each one of them was trying to hire or to attract Algeria in order to fill the void that was left by Russia in terms of the gas situation. And Algeria tried to skip this kind of embarrassing situation by stating that their infrastructure is unable to provide more oil that will be exported. And we know that Algeria is a very important strategic ally for Russia. Algeria is the third country that imports weapons from Russia, and also Russia supports them in the idea of the Western Desert. And also, Algeria is a very strategic alliance for the West countries as well. And there are also many agreements that were conducted and concluded between Algeria and the West countries, and that announced that they are committed to. Also, some other things are, for example, the stirring up of political tensions in the region. And this leads to the uprising of some of the demonstrations or strikes. And we witnessed that in Morocco and in Albania during the last few days of March in protest against the rise in fuel and food prices. Uh, the poor families were the most vulnerable and exposed to the increasing prices of fuel. This is a big burden for them. Also, Kenya, especially the Kenyan policy for supporting fuel was paralyzed after the war, and Kenya tried to benefit from that in terms of the prices of the oil, and they tried to keep supporting, but it is during April and May, but it is expected that this will stay for long because Kenya have their own problems in their own economy because it did not recover yet after the COVID-19 pandemic. And also, Kenya will face maybe political violence in the next period, especially that the presidential and legislation and parliamentary elections are coming in the next August. We also expect that there will be another round of violence between in the Middle Africa between the government and other militias, because there were some soldiers, a large number of soldiers from Signal on the Russian Signal group. They were in Central Africa Republic, and also they supported the government against the armed groups. And the void that will happen after Signal group will be leaving to Russia, these armed groups maybe will spread, especially that they were not totally eradicated, but they are still hiding in the forests. Also, as for Chad, it is expected that Chad, that is currently living a relative quietness state because Russia is busy dealing with the war, and Chad is a very strong ally for France in the recent period. And also, Russia supports the armed insurgency in Libya. So, large number of the armed rebellion in Libya. So, signal troops leaving Libya will lead to the quietness in Chad. Also, there is that big another thing that is very important, and this may happen, which is the increasing division inside the African uh, continent. And this speaks about that there is no doubt that the ineffectiveness of the decisions of some African organizations and the African Union in managing internal conflicts and disputes between member states and the failure to resolve crisis within the African continent gave the way for external interventions, which made the African continent a scene for international influence of world powers to compete. So thus, Russia may use its growing footprint in Mali as a bargaining chip when negotiating the relationship with France. Also, in Moscow's ability to help the the regime, the military regime junta in Mali, and Mali is has a lot of gold and a lot of minerals, and this will be a very important economic and geopolitical win for Russia. Also, another thing that is very important, that Africa was there. Africa was present diplomatically and again at the center on March 2nd, in which 25 African countries agreed on that decision, and 17 countries did not vote. Some countries like Morocco did not attend, and this may be considered an evidence that there is some kind of division in the African uh, continent, and that there is no one unified opinion or response for the continent. And maybe Russia will aim at finding a unified African vote in order to have this unified vote, or maybe to disperse and to uh, divide these opinions. And in both cases, it is a win for Russia. Another point I'll speak about, which is the future of Russia in the African continent and the enhancement of their presence in the continent. We also said before that Russia is trying to find their own interests in the region, especially from Libya in the north to Nigeria, Mali, and Niger in the west, to Ethiopia and Eritrea and other places in the west and east and middle of Africa. And here I would like to mention that partial withdrawal of signal Russian troops from some African countries, this does not mean that Russia is backing, going back or not supporting African continent. Maybe Russia has its own uh, balances to keep for the current priorities, but I think that the next period will witness increasing of the Russian role in the region. And here we have some of the international scenarios or future scenarios, and I think that there may be another Russian Western, there may be a new Russian-Western confrontation may erupt in the arena of African influence, and Moscow seeks to reduce the damages of international isolation imposed on it through the gateway to Africa, and also the dependence of the African ruling elites on Wagner will increase steadily with the French and American retreat in light of the escalation of security threats and the dangerous terrorist groups and organizations in the African continent. In addition, and of course, these ruling groups will ask the Russian troops to go back to these places. In addition to that, the ruling regimes, they will need signal groups or Wagner groups in order to face the potential popular tensions or the unrest as a result of deterioration of the economic and living conditions of a large segment of the African citizens during the economic period. In conclusion, we expect that the African continent will be a very important arena of the Western European, American, and Russian conflict, but no one will be winning, the only winning. But we want all the African leaders to deal carefully with the Russian authority, the European or even Chinese authority within the continent. And I hope that this war will be used for the interests of the African continent in order to gain wins regarding developing the infrastructure to develop in or to invest in the education and in other places as well, like the interest that happened during the Cold War period between the Soviet Union and the United States. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Shiri. Thank you for your important presentation. Now with Dr. Jihan Abdsalam, the Professor of Economy at the Higher African College at the Cairo University. She'll be speaking about the role of or the impact of the war. Welcome you all, Dr. Welcome you all. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here with you today in this very important webinar that is followed with passion. I will be speaking about the impact, the economic impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on African continent. Through speaking about this point, I want to speak about three very important points. The first one are the wins, because it's very positive and it can be something good for the African continent. So what are the expected economic gains for the African continent as a result of the Ukrainian-Russian war? First of all, the prices of energy prices will be impacted positively for the African and some African countries. So the African sources of energy, especially gas and oil, will be impacted. Of course, it is natural that the numbers will be increasing, even especially before the Ukrainian-Russian war. The prices increased by 62%, and after the war, and Russia is. So the European countries started now to. The European countries that import about 40% of Russia's oil have begun to search for alternatives to the Russian gas. So they started to find alternatives in the Middle East. But the Middle East is committed to some of the international and future agreements, like, for example, because of some agreements. Also, some other Middle Eastern countries like Libya have some problems, and this impacts their ability to produce. So in this case, some of the African countries can find good opportunities to provide oil or gas for the European countries with good prices. Some of the African countries have this opportunity to try to import gas to Europe. For example, like some countries announced that they have some of the very important gas with more than $30 billion, and this will be in the field of the natural gas, and this will be extended between 2014 and 2017. Also in Nigeria, they discovered a lot of reserves of gas there. Dr. Jihan.
شكرا لحضرتك. كذلك دول أخرى زي
Also, there
تنزانيا
are
زي
other
دولة
countries
السنغال
like
وهي عندها بالفعل
Senegal
اكتشافات تتعدى
have
40 تريليون
like
قدم مكعب
more
من
than
الغاز الطبيعي.
40
وبالفعل بدأت
trillion
بعض الدول الأخرى في
cubic feet
أفريقيا
of natural gas,
باكتشافات
and
من الغاز
other
الطبيعي زي
discoveries
نيجيريا
happened like
والنيجر
Nigeria,
والجزائر وعدد من
Niger,
الدول
Algeria, and some
الأفريقية التي
other
لديها سياق من
countries
الغاز الطبيعي، وبالتالي يمكن أن
have
تستغله
got gas,
للتوريد
and they
لبعض
can use it,
الأولوية
gas pipeline
وزيادة
in
من
order to
ارتفاع
export
الأسعار.
it to
هذا
Europe,
بالنسبة
to
إلى
the
الغاز. طب
European
ماذا
markets.
عن
This is
مصادر
regarding
الطاقة
the
الأخرى
gas. What about
وأهمها النفط؟
other sources of
زي ما
energy,
شاهدنا
especially
مع بداية الحرب
oil? As
الروسية
we
وانخفاض
mentioned
سعر برميل
with the
النفط
beginning of the
بشكل كبير ليتعدى
African-Ukrainian war,
حاجز
we found
ال
that
100
it
دولار
increased a lot
للبرميل،
to
وهو سعر مرتفع
the
جدا
price of
لم
the oil
يشهده أسعار
went raised to be above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014.
بالفعل هناك أزمة في الحصول على النفط
Also,
أيضا.
there is
أنا
difficulty
بحاول
in,
أظبط الصوت.
I'm trying to fix
كويس
the
حاليا؟
voice.
الصوت كويس ولا في مشكلة؟
Now it is
أنا
good.
آسفة
Go ahead.
أنا آسفة شكرا. بالنسبة للنفط ارتفعت أسعاره متجاوزة
So
ال 100 دولار
prices went
للبرميل.
above
وبالفعل
$100 a
بعض الدول
barrel of oil,
الأوروبية
and
بتعتمد على
also some
النفط
of the European
الروسي،
countries
ومع
depend on
حرب الروسية
Russian
الأوكرانية
oil
والانقباض
with the
العقوبات
Ukrainian-Russian
الاقتصادية
war and
أصبح
the
هناك
economic
صعوبة
sanctions
في
against
الحصول
Russia.
على
It is
النفط.
difficult
كذلك
for
البحث
them to
عن
get
البديل، والبديل
oil,
هو
so they
بعض
search
الدول
for alternatives.
الإفريقية
Alternatives can be some of
المنتجة
the
للنفط.
African countries that produce
أفريقيا فيها
oil.
عدد
In
كبير من
Africa,
الدول
we have large
الإفريقية
numbers
اللي
that
لديها
can
مخزون
produce oil,
كبير
and they
من
have big
النفط.
reservoirs of oil.
يعني هناك تعديل إرسال دول زي
Countries
نيجيريا
like Libya, Nigeria. Dr. Jihan.
أنا آسفة وإذا في مشكلة في صوت، آسفة جدا.
تفضلي دكتورة.
Go ahead, doctor.
بعتذر، يظهر هناك مشكلة
Apologies
في
for
شبكة
that.
الإنترنت. تمام.
Apologies for interruption.
أبدا أبدا تحت. هناك الدول التي
Also,
لديها
some of the
الكثير من
African countries
النفط
that
من
have
بلاد
big
المخارجة
amounts of
وبالتالي تستطيع
oil
هذه
like
الدول أن
Libya and
تستغل
others. These
احتياطات
countries
النفط
can depend
المتواجد
on their
لديها
own
للتوريد لبعض
oil in
الدول
order to
الأوروبية والاستفادة
export
من
for some
ارتفاع
European
الأسعار.
countries and to
إذا
benefit from the
انتقلنا
increasing
لمصدر آخر من المصادر
prices. So now
التي
we
يمكن أن
have
تمثل مكسب
another
إلى
source
الدول
that can be a
الأفريقية
win or
وهي
a gain for
المعادن.
the African countries, which
القارة
is the minerals. The African continent
دكتورة جيهان، يبدو أن الصوت انقطع.
دكتور جيهان.
الحصول على هذه المادة من روسيا، فأصبح هناك
In order to get this material from Russia, so now they are starting to find to search for alternatives to receive this important material and not to depend on Russia. There are also other minerals that are used in the manufacturing of automobiles or devices, so they will benefit a lot from the increasing number prices of these things. For example, we find here some the gold and other minerals will be increasing. So I think that this is a very important point, which is the raw material and maybe this is a very
تحديد
important point that
للأمن
can be
الغذائي
mentioned
أو
here, that
التأثير السلبي على الأمن الغذائي
there is a negative
في
impact
أفريقيا.
on the food security
يعني
in
لو انتقلنا
Africa.
لنقطة الأمن
And if we
الغذائي،
move to
أفريقيا
the food
تعتبر من
security,
الدول
Africa is
اللي
considered
بتعتمد
one
بشكل
of the
كبير على روسيا
continents
وأوكرانيا
that its
في
countries
الحصول
depend a lot
على
on Russia and
الغذاء
Ukraine
والحبوب
in
والزيوت.
gaining,
لو درسنا عن
receiving
الأهمية الاقتصادية
the
لروسيا وأوكرانيا
wheat
في
and the grains.
ورد للحبوب
So Russia and
والزيوت،
Ukraine is
تقريبا
a very
الدولتان
important
معا يستحوذان على
source of
53% من التجارة العالمية للزيوت
which is
وبذور عباد الشمس،
oil,
وحوالي
like for
ثلث
example
الحصة
sunflower
التجارة
oil,
العالمي
and the
للقمح.
third of the international
معظم إنتاج
trade in
من
terms of
الحبوب
grains or wheat.
والزيوت
So
يذهب إلى الدول الإفريقية
and
ودول
third of it
بعض
goes
الدول
to African
العربية، وبالتالي
countries and some
بمجرد
Arab countries as well.
عملية
So
يعني قطاع يعني بعض في هناك شكل موضح
and also
لحضرتك
there's something that is very important
ثلاثة
in this.
حالة. تمام كده واضح.
Is it clear now? Yes, now it's
تمام
clear.
تمام. زي ما واضح قدام حضراتكم في
As you
الشكل
see
ده
here in
بيوضح
front of
إنتاج
you,
روسيا
this
وأوكرانيا من الحبوب
figure indicates,
والزيوت.
or this chart
اللون
indicates the production of
الأحمر ده
Russia and
روسيا
Ukraine in
عفوا،
terms of
واللون الأصفر
the
أوكرانيا.
red color
فروسيا
Russia and the
تتفوق بشكل
yellow
كبير
colors for
في
Ukraine.
الحبوب،
Russia
وأوكرانيا يمكن
is
تتفوق بشكل
provide
أكبر
a lot
في
in barley,
الزيوت، ولكن
which is
روسيا
grains, and
وأوكرانيا معا
maybe
يستحوذان على الحصة
Ukraine is
الأكبر من
also
إنتاج
ahead in
الزيوت
terms of
والحبوب
sunflower oils, but
عالميا.
both
لو
provide
تحدثنا
this
عن
huge volume
أفريقيا في
oils
الشكل
and
رقم 4، الشكل يعني
barley.
بعد
And
هذا
if we
الشكل
look at this
مباشرة
chart
قدام حضراتكم،
here
زي
now,
ما
as you
حضراتكم
see,
شايفين روسيا
Russia
تقريبا بتصدر إلى القارة الأفريقية أكثر من 90%
provides African
من
continent
القمح
more than
الخاص، من
90%
إنتاجها
of
القمح
the
بيتم تصديره إلى
barley
القارة الأفريقية.
needed, or the wheat
تقريبا
needed,
6%
and
من
only
إنتاجها من
6%,
الزيوت
and
بيتم
also
تصديره
6%
إلى
of its
القارة
production is
الأفريقية،
exported to
والباقي
the
هي
African
ال4%
continent,
فقط
and the
بيتم تصديره
4%
لدول أخرى
are
غير
exported to
أفريقية.
other countries
ذلك
other than
الحال
the
في
African countries. And this is
أوكرانيا.
the same
أوكرانيا
when
أكثر
we
من
speak about the Ukraine.
48%
In
من
the
إنتاجها
Ukraine,
من القمح
more than
يذهب إلى
48% of
أفريقيا،
this oil
وحوالي
production goes to
31%
Africa,
من
and more
إنتاجها
than
من الذرة يذهب إلى أفريقيا أيضا،
31% of
و21% فقط
the
من
maize
الزيوت يذهب
goes
إلى
to
القارة
Africa, and
الأفريقية.
also
فهذا حجم
21% of other oils
ضخم.
goes to Africa as well. So this is a huge expectation and anticipation of the future.
دكتورة جيهان. الصوت انقطع دكتورة جيهان. دكتورة.
Dr. Jihan,
ممكن نلتقي الآن دكتورة إيمان.
we can now move to Dr. Iman
يبدو أن الاتصال
to
انقطع مع
deliver her presentation. Maybe, or maybe Dr. Jihan. Good
أهلا دكتورة إيمان. أهلا وسهلا.
evening, Dr. Iman. Welcome. Dr. Iman, welcome. Apologies for the disconnection that happened with Dr. Jihan. Now we'll move to Dr. Iman Al-Zahran, and she is a professor of specialized political studies. She will be speaking about the context and the drivers of the African stand-on position towards the Russian-Ukrainian war. Welcome to you, and welcome Dr. Shireen and Dr. Jihan. And the part that I want to speak about, maybe Dr. Shireen and Dr. Jihan talked about it in a way or the other, and maybe Dr. Shireen talked about some of these important points in terms of the security and defensive parts of these issues. But I'm going to speak about the context of the African position in terms of the individual stand. So I will try to explain the behavior of the African countries and the General Assembly of the division and of the opinion of Africa that happened regarding the condemnation of Russia at the General Assembly on the 2nd of March. And maybe 26 African countries out of 54 did not vote for the condemnation decision, while 17 countries did not uh, vote. And this leads to how this African bloc or position, the African bloc, and also the voting behavior of the African bloc, now it is not a receiver of the actions, but now it is an actional power or bloc and the African organizations. If we speak about the voting behaviors at the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 2nd of March, I think that this refutes or explains four main drivers: that there are countries that voted for the condemnation, or those that did not vote, or those that voted against the condemnation. I think, in my opinion, that there are countries that have these traditional alliances with Russia, and they would like to go through these alliances. And some other countries voted to refuse condemnation, and some others did not vote at all because they refuse the Western behavior that is not balanced. Some other countries in Africa found that Russian behavior are trying to reposition themselves in Africa, and they found that Moscow is trying to, and that there is
أنا أتوقع إنه ليس فقط الحديث عن فقط عن التصويت في الأمم المتحدة، ولكن كذلك الموقف الأفريقي بالنسبة للإطار المؤسسي، كيف تناولت
organizational framework and how did they deal with the general behavior or voting behavior within the international framework. And as mentioned by Dr. Shireen, the African Union, for example, the African Union and its assembly and its councils was dealing with neutrality. When they speak about, for example, the peacekeeping, providing peace, and also respecting international law, and also the ECOWAS, which is the Western Africa Economic Organization, condemned that behavior and asked all parties to work on finding a solution. And so and these different points, and also at the end of its statement, asked all parties to keep peace for all the members of the ECOWAS. Dr. Iman, the voice is not clear. Apologies. As for the last point regarding this context itself, I would like to speak about the historical links of how the African bloc dealt with similar conflicts, and this is conflict of international characteristics after the Second World War. Regarding the African bloc and the historical experience and how to deal with the Russian intervention in 2014 regarding the different problems and the island that dealt with this problem. And also it was very important, for example, when we speak about more than 35 countries and were very neutral regarding Crimea, which is a positive neutralism, and it was also pure neutrality because they did not want to get enrolled in an international conflict, and they didn't want this Eastern European conflict to be repositioned in Africa as a new shape of colonization to reshape their maps of power within Africa. Speaking about the current Russian-Ukrainian war, talks again about reshaping the different organizations and also how to go back to multipolaralism, not only the two polars, the US and Moscow, but also the several multipolars. And the African bloc, as we say, is not in its best shape of stability. There are many political chaos and political problems, and they are facing for any kind of the problems. As for the very important reasons that led to this positive neutralism or neutrality position, it was supported by first the historical links between Moscow and several regimes in the African countries. And by this, I mean regimes after the coups and the different coup movements, and how Russia supported many African countries, also supported providing security, speaking about, for example, in the Western Africa region, when they repositioned and filling the French void in the west of Africa. And Dr. Sheen mentioned Wagner forces, and this is the biggest example in this situation. Also other relations lead to the supporting the African continent in dealing with the international uh, crisis between Ukraine and Russia, and more than 30 military cooperation agreements between the African bloc and Russia, and also the exports. Russian exports of weapons are more than 18%, according to Stockholm Center in 2020, and I think that this increased as well because African imports of more than half of its imports of weapons come from Moscow. It's not only about the historical links or the military support, but also the different support and the transitional periods after the coups or the regaining of the governments, because political coup that happened in some of the African countries were especially against African countries. And they also, there is another idea here that I want to go to, which is Africa is usually against the European. Uh, when in last October, when there were some discussions by some continents speaking about racism, and this racism letter that was addressed to Emmanuel Macron in a clear message by Africans that we are against any kind of Western uh, to achieve neutralism, and also to have a stronger neutral position, which is, for example, to enhance the commercial and trade operations between Russia and the African countries, especially that although after the European sanctions against the Russian regime and the COVID-19 pandemic, we found that Russia and Africa have more than $20 billion of trade, and this is not a small number. This is a huge number that should be taken in consideration. And here I'm speaking about someone, and there is clear competition, and there is clear kind of swap, for example, or bartering and exchange between the Arab bloc, the African bloc countries, and also the Russia in terms of deals, training and counter-terrorism, confronting terrorism, and also stabilization in the south and the west of Africa. And all of this happens by the European military, in addition to also other things that we talked about, that the African continent is rich in terms of all minerals, like, for example, platinum, aluminium. All of these things are good swap notes that can support the continent in order to be more effective when we speak about how to reshape the dimensions of the Russian-Ukrainian war. One last point that I want to conclude with is the potential or possible repercussions of the African bloc content in order to receive support by the African continent. There are some countries that are still talking about some kind of mutual or joint spaces between the United States and Russia, and that the that they are trying to find some kind of comfortable or comfort in dealing with the situation. But generally speaking, there are some policies that can be described as neutral. So we hope that we are asking some questions in order to speak about the internal, regional, or external repercussions on our choice of being neutral. And I think that there are three main levels that we usually talk about when we assess the situation. So we assess it, uh, will there be any kind of neutralism? Will there be any gains because of being rested? And also we found that African continent is very far from the Russian-Ukrainian war, but there are some problems that speak about the facing the new or modern colonization, and also receiving the powers, places of power, and also proxy war, and also benefiting from different things before the Cold War. And creating this new Cold War on the African continent may lead to a very important results. As for the implications, given that there is huge we are speaking here about Russia and the African continent, that there are a number of suggestions that refer to Russia's support decreasing support that's provided for the African continent. For example, regarding counterterrorism. When we speak about these different possibilities, I think that Russia will be working more on supporting their vital place, and also having this part from wherever, or the different burdens on the African countries. As for the economic level, I think Dr. Shireen and Dr. Jihan as well talked about food security. And I think that food security, Ukraine and Russia is the first basket of feeding for all of the African countries. And as you know, wheat, barley, and corn is imported. When we speak about US or French alternatives, they are alternatives, but they are not fully mature. Speaking about the Ukrainian Russian war, maybe this happened later. These negative impacts of the trip and other negative repercussions on the internal sides, on developmental sides of the Arab countries. So I think that when we have these countries trying to reposition their place, and also other adaptations regarding to how to deal with the economic imbalances because of the Russian-Ukrainian war and the sanctions that are being provided by the African continent. And now there are not only dealing with that situation, but I think that how to deal with the size of or the volume of negative uh, applications, and also how to protect the African countries from the other places. We find that some terrorist groups are trying to be activating again in the inner part of the African bloc, like for example Al-Qaeda and other groups. So if they don't succeed in working on that, I think a civil war may exist. There may be some imbalance between different classes, social classes. Also, the African regimes to reconsider the situation and to think of how to deal with the situation, how to restructure it, whether neutral policies will continue to exist or will be reconsidered. I think that the Ukrainian war, Russian-Ukrainian war and crisis, although it has many direct threats to the African continent and huge volumes of challenges that will be facing the continent, political, security, and economic, but still there is a window for African parts, and I think that they will be used, Adi. And also, when we have some relations with the European bloc, for example, they are trying to find mutual interests, and also regarding the economic and investment dimensions. Now we are speaking about each one of them trying to, and, and the other parts in general, and I think they may be not intersecting with the internal level, only the government. And I think that the economic security standard is very important, and the harbors standard is very important. These are things that the African continent can use as kind of bargaining regarding the natural resources, the security situation, counterterrorism. All of these points are good, and it is good that the African continent is trying to utilize them. When we speak about win and lose ways, I think that the minimum the African countries can reach is to provide that, and it may lead to some big problems. And I think that having the balance between the negative repercussions may lead to speaking about the what serves their local strategies of the continent, and also the strategic vision of the African Union 2063. And I think that speaking may be very or too ambitious, but I think it can be utilized. There are large numbers of things that can be utilized, and also the African uh, bloc is now being more unified. We don't see the division that happened in the General Assembly of the United Nations. So we need to try to have one voice, one stand, one position, how to deal on all different levels, especially the political, economic, and military oils, in order to avoid the biggest problems and losses. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Iman, for your fruitful presentation. Now we'll go back to Dr. Jihan Abdesalam. Dr. Jihan, are you with us? Dr. Jihan, can you hear us? Dr. Jihan?
دكتورة
Dr. Jihan?
أوكي الحين تجهز دكتورة جيهان.
Okay, now Dr. Jihan is about to be ready. Until she's ready, we have Dr. Iman. I have a question for you. Is it possible to identify the Spanish, the change in the Spanish stand regarding the Sahari or the Saharan situation? Is it in favor of the European situation? The change of the Spanish stand against or regarding the Saharan profile, is it in favor of the European situation after the war? Generally speaking, the Sahara situation is changeable and variable, generally speaking, and we can find any of these countries, of course, are trying to find their own positions regarding their own agenda. For example, the European Union, their agenda is related to the powers, authority, places, and also the winning and loss. But from my own point of view, Madrid, for example, had this situation. Whether it is fact or not, it doesn't depend much on countries, for example, like France, like Italy, like the United States, especially, even if it's far from the Saharan profile, but they have another file or geopolitical power, and Russia كذلك intervened in the Saharan difficult. And I expect that one country will not do it. Now we're speaking about two countries that have, each one of them have his own agenda and facts and the different points of communication. And these points of communication intersect with each other. And so the situation of Madrid is a very is an opinion that needs to be structured, but I think they are not the biggest driver of the change of the profile. I was meaning the Moroccan stand. I think that Morocco is one of the parties of that decision, and it is not a decision that will be solved easily. So I think, yes, maybe Tunisia and Algeria had their own interests, and they found this issue protecting that work. So I expect that it will be an extended uh, bank, and I think it was very important to deal with them as not the definitive card, but maybe a card that opens a new room for more dialogue, conversation, to speak about pressuring cards and bargaining bargaining points as well. Thank you, Dr. Iman. I think that Dr. Jihan is now ready. Dr. Jihan, can you hear us?
دكتورة جيهان.
Dr. Jihan. Dr. Jihan, can you hear us? I have a question from Dr. Jihan to Dr. Iman. In her question, she says she wants to know about the increasing presence of China in Africa in light of the current situation. China, generally speaking, have a very increasing passion card regarding Russia and China and the communist blocs, and also the sanctions that happened from the European Unions, and at the same time against Russia. So in this situation, Huawei is trying to help find balance in the Russian policies. Regarding the impact of China on the African side, I think that, or I don't expect that this is a big change. Maybe for some problems regarding this situation will be washed the whole of it, not only some countries in Africa. And also there are some words are said about what will happen after Russia is out of the SWIFT system and how things were solved and how all of these points are being solved. So now we're speaking about parallel systems, again, similar to the European systems, in order to avoid the big impact that may happen. So I think that there are huge parts of investments and different kinds of investments in hydraulic studies, and also speaking about investment in harbors. China is far, very far from intervening in the political and security situations, and all of it things can be focused only about their policies in the African continent. Some of them focus more on investment, trade, manufacturing, and the rates of trade exchange, and also how to enhance the current situation, and also how to find a place for themselves on the African harbors. All of this is not very important for, these are very important for the Chinese policies, of course. Thank you, Dr. Iman. Dr. Jihan, are you ready? Dr. Jihan, are you with us? I have a question for you, Dr. Shireen. In which country or African continent countries we may find some proxy wars or proxy conflicts.
دكتورة شيرين.
Dr. Shireen.
بالطبع جميع الدول الأفريقية مهددة أن تكون ساحة للتنافس
I think this can be an arena for the competition between the West and China. And I think that countries that have direct relations with Russia currently, maybe they will, in the coming period, they will turn to an arena for competitiveness or for competition. And as we mentioned, Eritrea took the risk of voting in favor of Russia at the General Assembly. And I think that it is one of the countries that can be an arena for competition in the near future.
شكرا لك.
Thank you.
شكرا لك دكتورة شيرين.
Thank you, Dr. Shireen. We have another question as well. Is China benefiting in Africa because of this war? According to my own point of view, I think that China may benefit currently, and they have a clear strategy that is very important according to the strategy of the Belt and the Road, the Belt and the Road. And I think that the main goal of and also China may use this soft power model in Africa, and this is something that is known that Russia for example لن تتوقف على سير في هذا النوع أو أيضا لا تجبرها كذلك النظر في عملية التحول regarding the process of economic transformation. And I think in the next period, China will make use or take advantage of this war in order to pump more and more investments, huge amounts of investments in the African countries. And I think it is expected that the African regimes need to deal very carefully with these points, especially that it can make them fall in the debts. And because China pay a lot of money and they take the money back with high interest, so we need to be very careful when dealing with this trap of debt. Thank you very much. Dr. Shin, another question. Wagner forces leaving Africa, does it impact the European-Russia relations and the African coast? Of course, the French-Russian relations is impacted, especially regarding the African-Ukrainian war, and maybe in the future or in the near future, it will be impacted, especially that France was trying to impose its forces and power regarding how to get rid of or to counter terrorism in some of the African countries. But France was not very successful, but Wagner, the Russian troops were very effective and they won the trust of the African leaders compared to France. Yes, good job. Thank you very much, Dr. Shireen. Dr. Iman, there is a question for you. The question is, how can the African presence in Africa in the future be? In the future-wise, it's very ambiguous. And we have elections in France, and it is about to be revoting again. The numbers are close. We're speaking about different things that are very important. So I think that this sometimes is very different in terms of Macron and how to deal with the situation outside of this area. So then from the west of Africa, they are trying to put Russia against these parts, and they are trying to create balance. So I think that talking about the future of Chinese presence, it can be economic, it can be one of our top priorities, whether Macron wins or another position. I think that Africa will be able to hire economically trade, economy and trade and investment, but regarding the national relations related to the security policies and other things that are talking about, for example, the outcomes of the French the European African summit, how these things can be dealt with. And I think that this position can be more detailed when we receive when did that happen and what of the elections will be a winner, so that Emmanuel Macron, for example, may sign again for another visa. And this leads to having different kinds of these points and how the overlapping will be happening, especially regarding the uh, different kinds of plans, because they are changing a lot. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Iman. And we apologize because Dr. Jihan could not make it because of the technical glitch.
أوكي. لدي سؤال آخر.
I have another question from Mr. Muhammad Al-Atif for Dr. Iman. He said that we know that Cold War urged many competitions on other parts, and on the other hand, compared to the current war situation here. So when can we have this Cold War time again, and what is the imposing or change that is happening in the Russian? I think speaking about war and war terminology or the worst case scenarios, but the type of this war is not like before. There are now different kinds of troops, and people try, and also the non-organized or irregular war. And this is for me considered one of the fallout, which is related to using their soft powers and, and cultural and economic wars. All of these are considered one of the reasons that make it very evident in the new era. And according to my personal information, I think that there is increasing number of buying or hiring or attracting this economic factor in order to deal with it. And this kind of colonization that is happening now, there will be also some kind of hiring regarding the cultural whiteness. So the West and the Russia are not the only players. We have Turkey, Iran, all of them have their own cultural tools or their soft power, and it can be used for this kind of boxes. And I also think that these groups these wars are not just to take the troops back to what was the case before 2016, but I think that cybersecurity, we have touched upon that before, also African parts, and also how to deal with the situation, also reshaping the identity of the partners. This is a very important thing. And I think that also there are parallel investments as well, in addition to the different spectrum of terrorist groups that are using this kind of Cold War, and they are supporting their own, if we can say, mother company. So Cold War is already there, but the traditional way of this kind of trade is very important. And so I think that the very important question is how to adapt with this situation and how to deal it by the African continent countries. How will it be faced? How will it be? Will there be some kind of confrontation economically, socially, and others? So I think that the military coup and what happened and the West and the middle of Africa, this is considered one of the laws. This is also referring to how to deal with the situation using foreign members. That's why I was asking about this point. The main challenge, in my opinion, is how to face the situation or even adapting to it and how they can be approached in the future if there is no indeed master plans that will be followed. And for example, the activation of Coast and Sahara troops and the joint Arab troops, all of these are tools to face these new types of conflicts and wars. Thank you, Dr. Iman. I have another question for Dr. Shireen. Can China intensify their works in Africa and accelerate the Belt and the Road frequency if the Russian presence in Africa is decreasing? I think that the Russian-Ukrainian war will encourage them more to increase their own objectives in Africa, but China referred before that they have a plan and a clear strategy according to the Belt and the Road in the continent of Africa, and they were making good impact in order to deal with these problem points. And also China have a lot of investments inside Africa. So I think that in order to achieve their economic goals, China will need to seize these opportunities and use this goal. But according to the strategies, the strategy that there were no some clear indicators regarding the Middle East or the Arab region. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Shireen. Thank you, Dr. Iman. And I'd like to thank you all very much. I'd like to thank all the speakers. I'd like to thank Dr. Jihan Abdulsalam, and we apologize for the technical glitch that happened today. We'd like to thank all those who have participated with us, and I hope that you follow up with our the King Faisal Research Center for Research and Islamic Studies future events. Thank you very much, and peace be upon you all. Thank you very much. Thank you.